Hey, what's going on? I'm Monz, and this is Monz on the Mic, where we uncover what's going on in the news. We cover the chaos that's occurring in Congress. We decipher Supreme Court decisions that come down that affect all of us. And once in a while, we're going to go into some crazy cop stories that occur all across the nation. And if you're interested in crazy cop stories, check out my new book, 20 and Out. It's available on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle, and it makes a great Christmas gift. So let's dive into the news and see what we got going on. Today, we're going to be covering the election of Mamdani, who has been elected to be mayor of New York City. He ran as a democratic socialist, which is very interesting to me because socialism conflicts directly with our Constitution and the way that our republic has been set up. So, what I'd like to focus on today specifically is how he plans to lower crime in New York City, since that is an area that I was involved in for 20 years, serving as an NYPD police officer and detective. So, Mamdani's plan is going to be creating a Department of Community Safety. He has a proposed budget for this plan of $1 billion, 1 billion with a B. Where he's going to get that money from hasn't been stated specifically. He has stated that he is going to cut overtime from the New York City Police Department, and that will probably be used to fund some of this. But as far as the rest of the $1 billion, I'm not sure where he's going to be getting that, but this is his plan. So he says he's going to create a Department of Community Safety, and it's going to handle mental health crises, homelessness, and he's going to expand the violence interrupter programs. Sounds all wonderful. Well, first off, with the mental health crisis, what you really should call it is handling EDPs. And EDPs are emotionally disturbed persons. That's what it's short for. Emotionally disturbed persons are probably one of the most dangerous jobs that police officers respond to. Emotionally disturbed persons are unpredictable. One minute, you're going to think that they're all nice and cheery, and the next minute, they're going to descend into violence. I've experienced that myself. We handled a lot of EDPs. I remember one time we had a female EDP and she seemed all nice and we were talking and hanging out and she just was hearing voices and she wanted to go to the hospital. No problem. So we go into the ambulance and she doesn't want to sit down on the bed, that she has to sit down on for transport. And I'm trying to convince her to go and sit down on the bed. And, this is my seat here and you lay down and be comfortable. And she just decides, no, I'm not doing that. And she checks me into the side of the ambulance wall. So out of nowhere comes this act of violence. So of course I grab her hair, thinking, where the head goes, the body will follow. And as I grab her hair to yank her onto the bench of the ambulance, it comes right off in my hands. I didn't realize that she was wearing a weave. And so now I'm holding a handful of what was her hair, and now she's just staring at me, bald, screaming at me that I ripped her weave off of her head. That all ended fine. She went to the psych ward, but the unpredictability and the violence of people who are emotionally disturbed is well known, well documented. And I don't understand how he's going to have civilians who most likely are not going to be carrying guns or any other weapon handle people, because there are times, and as much as I would like to reason with people and try and talk them down from whatever was going on, obviously that's the objective at all times, is to de-escalate in policing. Sometimes it's necessary to use force. So I'm not sure where he's going with that. I guess they're going to end up calling the police when they need it, and hopefully none of those people get hurt. The homeless crisis, I'm on page with him. You can't have homelessness. First of all, it's horrible in the wintertime, but a lot of the times these people do not want to go to the shelters. The shelters are poorly run. They're riddled with crime. They're filthy. And frankly, they're just safer on the street. And most of the time, mental health and homelessness go hand in hand. That's just a fact of the matter. It's drug abuse and mental health issues that cause a lot of the homelessness. So I would like to have specifics on how his plans are. I don't like how these politicians graze over their plans of, yeah, we're going to have mental health crisis, we're going to fix it. Okay, how are you going to do that? Let's get down to the nitty gritty. So when he says expand violence interrupter programs, that's where I wanted to dive into the nitty gritty, because that's my wheelhouse, if you will. And I'd like to know how he's going to interrupt violence. So what he's going to do with this program is base it on the Cure Violence framework. So Cure Violence is a group that did studies in cities all across America and Puerto Rico And what they did was they would train people in the community, gang leaders or older people, OGs, if you will, who live in the neighborhood, and they train them to help to work with the youth of the neighborhood, who are the ones generally who commit the crimes, and train them how to handle this so that they can de-escalate situations, have gang members sit down at the table and try and work things out so that it doesn't turn to violence on the street. It's a novel idea. I love it. Let's see where it goes. So I said, okay, well, let's look into the Cure Violence program and see how they did with their studies. So they have all of these studies, and I pulled the one from Crown Heights, Brooklyn, that they conducted in 2010 because I'm familiar with New York City, and that is something that I can understand in the language that they're speaking. Plus, they use NYPD stats, which I'm extremely familiar with. So what they did was they used Crown Heights as their focus area, and they used the neighborhoods around Crown Heights, which were Bed-Stuy, Bushwick, and Brownsville, which have relatively similar demographics and crime rates, to compare and track the crime in these neighborhoods and see how they did before the SOS intervention and then see how it did after the SOS intervention. They only did the SOS intervention in Crown Heights, right? So, what they did in their study is they provided a table that was based on NYPD stats for the Crown Heights precinct for the year 2009. So, the stats for Crown Heights that year happened to be 51 shootings and 13 homicides. So, what they're basically working on is we got to lower those numbers for 2010, and then we will be successful in our endeavors, right? So, that's what they're going out to prove. So, as an aside, before we dive into the study, summer traditionally obviously has more crime. There's more people out, there's more beef, people bump into each other more often. So July, August, September are your peak moments of crime. And then usually before the holidays, robberies will spike. But January, February, March, crime dies down, the numbers plummet. So the time of year that you're doing this study needs to be done at the right time because you can skew the numbers just based on the weather. They started their study in the summer of 2010. So I give them that at least they started it at a time when crime is skyrocketing normally. So what I also noticed about this study before I got to the end result of it was that it didn't take into account any type of arrests for any of the precincts. So when I worked in Queens, if we had a big takedown of guns or a big takedown of a gang, that would obviously lower the crime for a month or 2 months or even longer, depending on jail sentences, what type of vacuum was created by the gang, and if other gangs were rivaling to take over that vacuum, if there would be retaliatory shootings. All of these, there's so many variables that affect the crime rate. You can't just really just say one thing works. You really have to take into account the entire picture. And I didn't see anything in the study that took into account any major arrests that had happened in any of the precincts, not Crown Heights or the other three variable precincts that didn't have the Cure Violence program implemented. So as I continued through the study, I noticed the biggest glaring problem with it is that when they were looking at the crime stats from 2009 to the end of 2010, they combined the three precincts, Bushwick, Brownsville, and Bed-Stuy, into one line on the bar graph, and they compared Crown Heights by itself. And they said, well, look at how low Crown Heights crime is when SOS was implemented. It went down so much, and all the other precincts went up. Well, of course, if you're going to combine three precincts together, the crime is going to be higher than comparing it to one precinct. So I'm not following how that's logical at all. I sat there and I looked at this bar graph and I'm thinking to myself, I must be misreading this because nobody would think that this actually makes sense to combine three precincts and then compare it to one and say, look how much the crime went down in the one that we had Cure Violence intervention in. But that's what they did. And they even said comparison precincts combined. They labeled it on their bar graphs. So right away, this study in my mind is completely debunked. And you can't really use this as a measure of Cure Violence coming in and lowering crime because you're comparing it to every other precinct combined. Another part of the study that was done was a survey that was taken 2 or 3 months after the Cure Violence program started. 24% of the people that were asked said Crown Heights is more violent than other Brooklyn neighborhoods. And 38% of people said the same thing 16 months after the program was fully operational. So basically, Public perception alone indicates that this Cure Violence program did nothing to deter crime or the perception of the crime that's occurring in the neighborhood, which is really half the battle. According to Cure Violence, during their Save Our Streets study, which is the SOS study, the program did not have a significant impact on residents' sense of safety in the neighborhood or opinions of the legitimacy of carrying guns or joining a gang for protection. So I'm quoting from the study. One inadvertent finding in the study was that of those who witnessed gun violence, 56% supported carrying a gun for protection versus 35% who had not witnessed firsthand gun violence. What they're basically saying is that if people see that violence is going on, if the perception is that there's a lot of violence, they're going to want to go and get a gun. And they say that it's better to have a gun, which is actually what we're seeing currently now. Mamdani hasn't even been sworn in, and there is an increasing demand on concealed carry permits in New York City, because people are concerned that he's going to continue this defund the police policy, and crime obviously is going to skyrocket. And the last thing that the study had is they utilized NYPD statistics to show the crime in 2009 prior to their implementation of the Cure Violence program. However, at the end of the study, after they did all of their going out into the neighborhoods and talking to gang members and trying to get people to turn away from violence and to talk instead of kill each other, they did not go to the NYPD, who keeps crime stats, and say, hey, can we get the table for violence in 2010 in Crown Heights so we can see exactly what our numbers are. If you're going to compare numbers and have all these bar graphs and all these fancy looking things, let's compare numbers. Let's look at the crime stats for Crown Heights in 9, and let's look for it at the end of 2010 and see if we actually had an impact. They didn't provide that. That information is so old at this point that you'd have to FOIA for the information. I wasn't able to obtain it on my own, but they should have provided it in the study to actually show, yeah, we had 51 shootings and 13 homicides in 2009, but since the implementation of our Cure Violence program and trying to deter crime in Crown Heights, we only had 2 shootings and 0 homicides or something like that. So none of that was done at the end of the study. There was no graph of NYPD statistics to compare it to. So in my opinion, this whole thing kind of reminds me of the implicit bias training, where it's just based on false information and they go from there. So I have a problem with this entire study. I think it's tainted. I can't rely on their stats when they clearly have an agenda to prove that their program works. Probably they're getting a ton of money for it, and it only behooves them to say, yeah, look at how wonderful our program is. And really, it doesn't look like it is. It certainly doesn't increase the public's perception that, crime has gone down. So what actually does decrease crime in New York City? What are the actual proven methods? Because according to the Cure Violence program, they don't have the answer. Going out into the community and talking with the leaders of the community, the religious leaders, the gang leaders, the guys who used to be gang leaders who did a bid in jail, and they come out of prison and they want to turn the community around and turn these kids better, and they go to the high schools and talk. All of these are wonderful attempts at violence interrupting. But unfortunately, when you have a community that listens to music that epitomizes shooting people and selling drugs and not going to school and not doing well in school and setting up a business for yourself and doing something productive for society, well, that's hard to get away from. If you're going to condone that type of behavior, we need to change the whole mindset of the community. So number one, in my opinion, is that in most of these homes where these kids are going out and shooting people and joining gangs, there is no father figure. There is no father figure in the home. There's no leadership. And when you don't have a father in the home, you don't have somebody who disciplines the children, tells the boys how to act, how to be a gentleman, how to be a man, and how to do well in school and to do better for yourself and to better your own situation. And the cause for that directly can be related to Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society and the program before that with FDR, which happened after the Great Depression. And you can go into it, and maybe in a future podcast, I'll go into how this was so detrimental, especially in the Black community, because what it did was it said basically for the Great Society, if we have mothers who don't have fathers in the home because they died or they're sick or whatever the situation is, the mother doesn't really have a way to earn a living and she can't support her children. So to prevent them from starving to death, basically, we need to give them money. So what they did was they said, if you don't have a father in the home, we will give you money. So what did that do? It incentivized the men to leave the home, because why would you not go and get free money if it was being handed out to you? So the fathers left the home. And there are plenty of statistics and studies that have shown that since the Great Society program was implemented by President Johnson, broken homes has increased, I think, like 70%, especially specifically in the Black community. And this is what has really been the heart of the matter. And this is what the problem is. The other thing is punishment. We need to have harsher penalties for criminals. Kids go out on the street and they know that they're going to do 2 years if they get arrested with an illegal firearm. They're not going to carry the firearm. How do I know that? Personal experience. There was a time when if you were caught with a gun, you would do a mandatory 2 years. There was no plea bargaining. There was no, oh, well, maybe we'll give you a slap on the wrist. You were doing 2 years. And back then it was 16 years old. You were treated as an adult. They did this wonderful thing called raise the age law. So they raised the age of being charged an adult to 18 instead of 16. And that only encourages kids to act out and commit criminal acts, because when you have no punishment, why wouldn't you do that? Family court doesn't punish. Well, he's just a kid. It's his situation. We don't need to punish him. Let's help him out. And maybe we'll try all these diversion programs. None of it works. You have to have harsh penalties. I would be told specifically when I was working, especially when I was in anti-crime, that the perps would tell me straight up, or not even perps, just people in the neighborhood would tell me straight up, we don't carry in your precinct because we know that you guys are out there, meaning the anti-crime guys, that you're be tossed and they're going to go to jail for 2 years. So they actually specifically will not carry. They'll leave their guns at home because they know we're out there. The police are out there. We're going to be looking for them and seeing if they're carrying a gun. And if they are, they're going to do jail time. And there's no negotiation for that. So obviously, if you don't have the guns on these people on the streets, you're not going to have the shootings. So that is just obvious common sense. Enough with the nonsense about the cops and we target people and everything. When you're a police officer, and there's been Supreme Court decisions that back this up, we know what we're looking at. We know what we're seeing. We've been doing it long enough. You can tell when somebody has something. We also know a lot of the gang members that live in the neighborhood that carry. So this isn't rocket science. These basic tenets, these broken windows programs that Giuliani started, these work. You step away from that and crime goes nuts. And once we have crime going nuts, now we have the optics of it, right? You have the news coming in and saying with shooting, shooting, shooting. Now it happens in high tourist areas. Now the word gets out that, you know what, New York City isn't really as safe to go to anymore. Now our tourist dollars plummet. Now we're looking at financial ruin. So you need to have safe streets, and these are the ways to do it. And as far as all the other programs that Mamdani wants to do to replace the police department, police work is dangerous because it's unpredictable. When I was going to a job and Central or the radio dispatcher would say, hey, there's a gun here. It was observed. This is the person who has the gun. This is what they are wearing. I would say, okay, good. I know what I'm going into. But when I go to a job and you don't know what's going on, and all of a sudden you think everything's calm and everything's wonderful, and then somebody pulls out a knife or somebody pulls out a gun, or now somebody's fighting you because they don't want you to bring their dad to jail or their brother to jail. Now you have a problem. And these violence interrupters are not going to have the tools on their belt to actually defend themselves. And so they're going to have to call us. But my favorite saying, when seconds count, the police are just minutes away. You're going to have a lot of people getting hurt. There's a reason why all of these jobs were allocated to the police department, because we are social workers. We do try and help these people. I appreciate the help they're going to give us, the supplementation of all these other programs. But at the core, you have to have police, and you have to have people like the district attorneys putting these people in jail for an extended period of time, the maximum allowed that the law allows, when they commit a crime, and you will see crime plummet. That's just a matter of fact. That's just how it is. And I saw it over the 20 years in the New York City Police Department. This is what works. Active policing, backing up your cops, not having corrupt police. That's a totally different story. And I obviously do not condone that. But having cops that aren't afraid to go out there and toss people that are looking like they're carrying a gun and getting these guns off the street. That's the only way to do it. Mamdani is a self-described socialist, and it concerns me because he either is completely oblivious to the reality of the situation, which is dangerous, or He knows what his programs are going to do, and he is aware that New York City is going to descend very quickly into chaos, and he doesn't care. Either way, both of those options are a hard no-go. And we are going to have some serious problems in New York City now that this guy has been elected and is going to take the reins on January 1st. So we'll see what happens. We'll see how quickly everything descends. And it just came out recently that Hochul is actually going to increase the corporate tax rate in New York State to pay for Mamdani's programs. So for my New Yorkers, are you going to be okay when you live upstate New York or out on Long Island that your money is being sent into New York City to pay for people who haven't earned anything, aren't working for it, and are getting handouts? Because that's what it looks like is going to be happening. And the reason why you should care about what's happening in New York City is because the socialism is a cancer that is spreading throughout the country very rapidly. Seattle just elected a mayor that is a socialist. These programs sound wonderful. They sound great to people who are lazy and don't want to work and don't want to earn for themselves. They don't grasp that a government big enough to give you everything that you have is big enough to take away everything you have. Those lessons have been forgotten. They're not taught in school anymore. And that is what we are facing if we continue to elect these people. So on the one hand, we're in trouble in New York City, in my opinion. On the other hand, New York City is the perfect place for socialism to take over because it's going to be very hard to hide, even if you try and tell the news not to show the stories. It's going to be very hard to hide the fact that government supermarkets have empty shelves. Government run anything is always going to be less efficient than privately owned, privately run businesses that have competition with each other. So we're going to see how that goes, and we will follow up with it. And stay tuned because I don't think it's going to turn out in any way positive. But speaking of violence, we're going to pivot now into this guy Crooks. If you will remember, he was the man who attempted to assassinate President Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. Crooks was basically accused of climbing onto the rooftop of a nearby building when Trump was giving a rally in Pennsylvania prior to him being elected president. And he climbed on top of this building with a ladder, seemingly unobserved by all of the police and law enforcement presence that was there at the time. He pulled out an AR style rifle, firing several rounds, hitting Trump, killing one of the firemen who was attending the rally, injuring others. And he also had two IEDs in his vehicle that were found after the incident occurred. They were capable of being remote detonated and had the detonator on his body, which was recovered after he was shot and killed. So it's possible that he thought maybe he was going to get away and set the remotes off to distract law enforcement from him fleeing the scene, basically. But I mean, the whole situation in Butler is disturbing. I don't understand it at all. He had used a drone earlier in the day to scout out the location and see where the best place would be to basically set up a sniper's nest and take some shots at the president. He brought a ladder to the rooftop. Nobody sees this. So in any case, he's killed by a Secret Service sniper, and the FBI recover a cell phone, a laptop, and USB drives that Crooks had. And they have repeatedly stated since then that he had no internet presence, he had no social media. Tucker Carlson, who used to be a Fox News host and now has his own network, Tucker Carlson Network, recently released an entire report on Crooks, which was fascinating. So what his investigative reporters did is that they identified the cell phone number, which had been released through a prior intel report. And through that phone number, they were able to identify his email. And from that email, they were able to find encrypted foreign email services, a Snapchat profile, a Discord profile, and a deactivated YouTube account, amongst a bunch of other things, Venmo and other apps that he had utilized. Now we're going to go into the YouTube account of Crooks, right? So he has posts on YouTube from 2019 to 2020. He posted violent extremist content, and it was basically about shooting or killing Ilhan Omar. These people they don't belong here. They should be deported. The invaders need to get out. Nothing that obviously I or any rational thinking human would condone. Now, 2020 happens and suddenly his tune changes. So this is during COVID, and all of a sudden he turns his angst against Trump. And wants Trump to be killed, and there's all kinds of posts anti-Trump. And what's interesting to me is that was a dramatic shift. And in the course of maybe a month or two, all of a sudden now he has gone from hating the left to hating the right and demanding them to be dead. So the bottom line was he was always for violence, political violence specifically. But what was it that made the turn? Well, Tucker Carlson's investigators found out these messages that this guy, Willie Tepes, now, was he a real person? Probably not. Was he a plant from somewhere? Supposedly, this guy has ties to an Antifa group overseas in a European country. We don't really know who this person was or if this person actually even really exists and who they work for. Some of the things that Willie Tepes had messaged Crooks was, quote, authority comes from the barrel of a gun, which is a famous Mao Zedong quote when Mao was taking over China and making it communist. And we have nothing left to lose. A global police state is unacceptable. So it sounded like Willie was kind of encouraging Crooks that he needed to do something and we need to act, and sitting around doing nothing is not going to solve the problem. So the first question is, who is this guy? And how did he find Crooks online in the first place? Why is the FBI saying there is no digital footprint? There's no known motive. The parents aren't talking. And when questioned in a hearing, Patel had said that he's going to discuss the information when the trial is over. Well, you're not going to have a trial for a dead guy because he's dead and there's no need for that. So, in my mind, if you're having a trial, it's because you're actually doing the deep dive into who his contacts were and what kind of connection he has with whoever it was that maybe inspired him, encouraged him, coerced him. But you have a guy who was going to shooting ranges where government officials, FBI, CIA, were known to go to. And this guy's going there practicing shooting. He learned how to build bombs with remote detonators from somewhere. Where did he get the money to buy all this stuff? And how did he stay off the radar for all of these years that he's making these threats? And the FBI has no idea who he is. So, but what we do know is that Crooks shot Trump. He was shot and killed. Somehow he made a quick switch. So I would like to surmise that it is possible that there is a program called MK Ultra. And I know you're going to all of a sudden your eyes are going to glaze over, but hear me out, because I think that this might have had something to do with it. And I think that this had a lot to do with maybe a lot of the assassinations and shootings that are happening all over the country. So what is MK Ultra? Well, MK Ultra is a CIA operation that has been declassified. It happened in the 60s, and it was preceded by Operation Blueberry and then Operation Artichoke. Why did it start in the first place? Well, basically, the Soviet Union was working on mind control experiments, and they were trying to see if they could make an ultimate soldier and assassins. And so the United States, the OSS, and then they turned into the CIA, said, we got to keep up with them, right? Because we can't let them get ahead of us. So we have to do our own tests for mind control. So they started Operation Blueberry, which turned into Operation Artichoke. And the goal of Operation Artichoke was to see if they could get somebody, a normal person, to commit an assassination and maybe not remember that they did it. So that was the initial goal of Artichoke. And then from Artichoke came MK Ultra. So what is MK Ultra? Basically, the tenets of MK Ultra was, part of it was honeypot operations. So they would have CIA officers hire out prostitutes, and they would get people to come in and do their thing with the prostitute, and then the prostitute would slip them a drug and then see if they would do things that a normal person wouldn't do. But the purpose of MK Ultra was basically to get mind control over people. They would slip them LSD, and they wanted to see, can we get somebody to be controlled by one person and do what we want and maybe not remember what they did. Maybe they're going to go and do an assassination, or they're going to go shoot some people, and they're not going to really know what they're doing because they're controlled by a person. Do we have the capability of doing that? This program was started in the 50s. It went on in the 60s, and supposedly it had stopped because Congress got a hold of it, and there was a huge uproar that these people are being tested on without their knowledge, without their consent, and it's un-American, unconstitutional, violating all kinds of human rights. Why would you stop a program that could be so beneficial, especially if you want to safeguard the country? I don't personally think that they stopped it. I think that it kept going, and I think that they've perfected it. And I think that they peruse the internet, they find this guy who is talking about, I want to kill people, I want to kill people. And they're like, we got a guy that we can use. So we're going to start feeding him some anti-Trump, anti-MAGA, anti-right wing, you name it stuff, get him to hate Trump. And then we'll just give him a little push and see where he goes. There's a lot of other theories that he didn't act alone. I haven't seen any evidence for that. I think that the shots were very clearly coming from him on the roof. So that remains to be seen. But they cremated his body like 10 days after he was killed. So we don't know, did they take samples? Did they take blood samples, tissue samples? So we know if there was some type of drug that had been administered somehow. Was he on something? We don't have any of those answers. So the fact that we have a president who there was an attempted assassination on a president-elect, a prior president, and we have zero information on it, and the FBI is still stonewalling and refusing to provide information, it's one of two things. Either there's a cover-up going on, or there is an investigation going on and they don't want to comment on it and they just want it to kind of go away so that they can do their investigation and not raise up people that they're onto them. So we'll keep following that and see where it goes. But the MK Ultra program was a real program. It was about mind control. The CIA ran it, and I think it might explain the complete 180 turn that Crooks had in between 2019 and 2020. But we'll find out about that. So now moving on to happier stuff. Next week is Thanksgiving, one of my favorite holidays. So I would like to go into what is the meaning of Thanksgiving, because people just think, oh, it's time to get together and we eat a ton of food and we watch football and we sit on the couch and pass out and eat some pumpkin pie. Well, let's find out the meaning of Thanksgiving, because one major importance for me is we need to know about our history. If we don't know about our history, then people can change it and change what actually happened and then make us think, wow, maybe our country isn't that great. We had a lot of bad stuff, but we had a lot of good stuff that changed the entire trajectory of mankind. So I'd like to go into the meaning of Thanksgiving and where it first happened. So in 1619, British settlers land in Virginia. They read a proclamation, obviously grateful. They just sailed on a wooden boat across a violent ocean and they finally made it to land. I would be kissing the ground, right after I probably puked my brains out. But they read a proclamation designated December 4th as a day of thanksgiving to God and declared that this day be kept holy and perpetually celebrated as a day of thanksgiving to the Lord. So that was the first recorded day of Thanksgiving in America. In 1621 in Massachusetts, Governor Bradford and the Pilgrims survived their second winter thanks to Squanto. And that's another fascinating story we'll get into another time. And Bradford declares a day of Thanksgiving and invited the Native American tribe to celebrate with them. It was basically, we survived. We're lucky we're not dead. Let's eat a ton of food and be happy and celebrate with the people who helped us to survive. And since we were talking about socialism earlier with Mamdani, I think it's really fitting to mention that the Pilgrims in Massachusetts learned from 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, which says, if anyone does not provide for his own, especially those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So Pilgrims in Massachusetts adopted this. They identified private property rights, and they gave everybody their own plot of land and everybody farmed their own land. And they after some help from the Squanto specifically, who taught them how to farm and raise corn and other crops that were native growers to the Northeast, they flourished. In Virginia, it was a completely different story. They practiced a form of socialism where all the crops that were grown were put into one big bin and people would take as they needed. So what that did was basically the people who didn't feel like working, because a lot of people are inherently lazy, they were like, well, I'm not going to work. So I'm just going to help myself to the food that everybody else had to work for. And, nobody's going to say anything to me. So the people that work said, well, to heck with this. I'm not working anymore. Why am I going to do this? So they would make excuses why they couldn't work. I have an injury. I'm ill. I can't work anymore. So what ended up happening is there were no crops. So people were literally starving. I mean, you got to the point where they were stealing from local Indian tribes in order to be able to eat. There is some evidence that cannibalism was prevalent during this time. So Governor John Smith comes in and he goes, you know what? If anyone is not willing to work, then he's not eating. And that is actually a quote from the Second Thessalonians in the Bible. And the colonists turned and they harvested their own food and they flourished. But after a while, they turned away from this principle and they went back to this form of socialism. They starved, almost didn't make it through a winter, and basically 60 people out of 240 survived after that winter of nobody's going to be farming. So when you support competition, private property, free market capitalism, or not just the poor people, but the rich people, everybody flourishes. It raises everybody up out of poverty and everybody's able to support themselves. Socialism, they don't want you to support yourselves because you're too dumb to. So the government's going to come in and the government's going to take away all private property rights. They're going to commandeer commercial buildings, residences, and they're going to distribute it as they see fit, basically completely turning against the Constitution of this country. And that is not a recipe for anything but disaster. So, if we're going to take a lesson from history, we should look at the first Thanksgiving and say, you know what? The people that practice socialism and everybody, works together for the common good type of a thing doesn't always work out. Christianity teaches that if you do have, you should give and you should help the poor. Socialism says, no, 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 I know better. I'm the government. I'm here to help you and I'm going to take everything from you and give it to somebody else who doesn't want to work because equity, which is complete and utter nonsense. All it does is basically, as Margaret Thatcher said, eventually you're going to run out of other people's money and everybody's going to be completely broken poor. And because nobody farms anymore, you can't raise your own crops. And so you're going to starve. We've been down the road of socialism before. History has told us so. Nobody studies this stuff because they don't want you to know that it's always been a failure. But if it wasn't for the free market, private property rights, probably none of the pilgrims or the colonists would have survived. And America maybe wouldn't have ever been populated. So we have to thank the Bible's guidance for helping the settlers, the pilgrims, and the colonists. And we have to pray that Mamdani somehow is restrained by the laws in New York City and New York State and isn't able to implement a lot of the socialist programs that he wants to. But that remains to be seen, and we will find out. So that's going to conclude our episode for today. But I would like to pray that everybody has a wonderful Thanksgiving and remember that we do live in a wonderful country. It's an amazing country. It's worth fighting for. And there were a lot of people that suffered greatly so that we can live in luxury. So thank you very much. Tune in next time on Monz and the Mic. We'll go into other current events. And again, check out my book, 20 Ann, out on Amazon. It makes a great Christmas gift. It's available in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle. So I will see you next time.